In other words, they're going to complain about what we could call extra evil. That is, when we look at the world, it seems like there's a lot of evil in the world, and a lot of it seems to be extra. What I mean by that is that there's more evil, right? There's extra evil, more than would be necessary for God to reach his goal, it seems. So it seems like there's more evil or more badness in the world than is absolutely necessary. So the atheist will say, explain that. So, and of course, that is what we have to explain. There is a lot of badness in the world. And sometimes when we're trying to explain why there is all this badness in the world, we might not think about all the badness that there is. But if you just think about all the badness there is, first we have natural disasters, earthquakes, floods, fires. We have things like sickness and disease. We have animal suffering. This is what we call natural evil. Now, I know we don't really think of this as evil, right? Because when we think about bad things happening, we usually think about bad things that are happening to human beings, right? And I care most about why do bad things happen to me. But really, you could say that there's a lot of bad things that happen in the world, and not all of it affects me. And now to be sentimental, I mean, there are other kinds of badness in the world that you might not even consider bad necessarily. But for philosophers, they're bad. Okay, so not to be sentimental, but if I walk out here and I see a small flower that's just beginning its life, it's growing. It's just begun its life. And then I see one of these stupid cats come along and step on the flower. And the flower is crushed, and the flower dies. Maybe it's just me, but there's something kind of sad about this. And you think about it, right? This is death, this is destruction. And it's not just that. But when you see that kind of thing happening, the question you might ask yourself is, why would God even create that flower in the first place if it was just going to be stepped on and die before it even reached adulthood? What's the point? It just seems like a big waste. This may seem like crazy, but it may seem crazy, but you could say that, I mean, usually we think that flowers have a kind of purpose in life. Maybe that sounds crazy to say, but do flowers have a purpose in life? Do they have a reason to exist? Yeah. They're supposed to reproduce. They're supposed to bloom. They're supposed, they're supposed to grow. They're supposed to do something, right? So if a plant dies before it gets the chance to do any of those things, it seems like a waste. Its life seems pointless. It seems as though there was no reason for it existing. Now, when I talk about a flower, it may not seem like a big deal to you, but of course, when the same thing happens to a human being, when a human being is born and their life is cut short before they even get a chance to do in life what we think they were meant to do, before they even get a chance to do what we think they were created in order to do, then we begin to wonder, why would God create this life at all? So for philosophers, this is a problem. and it requires explanation. We have to explain why it is that things never fulfill the purpose in life for which they were created, apparently. The other thing is that I can go into a forest somewhere and find a bird that is born with a mutilated wing. There are birds born with only one wing. This is another problem, because I think that God has a pretty clear picture in his mind of what a bird should look like. And when I look at a bird with one wing, my first thought is, well, what's the problem there? If God knows what a bird should look like, then why doesn't this bird look like that? Is it that God somehow failed to make this bird look the way he wanted a bird to look? So this is another problem we have to explain. Okay, so you can see that in a certain sense, explaining why bad things happen to human beings is easy, relatively easy. It's much harder, in fact, to explain why bad things happen in general. So what I'm going to talk about a little bit more than maybe you expected is, why is it that we live in a world where bad things happen in general? Why are things that seem bad? Right? Why is it that there is badness in the world, even kinds of badness that doesn't necessarily affect human beings? So, here's what we're going to do. What I'm proposing is, what I'd like to do is give you different explanations. I think that no philosopher has given one explanation that explains all the evil in the world. However, I think that if you take some of the explanations that philosophers have given for evil and you combine them, you might be able, with taking all those explanations in combination, you might be able to, with all of those explanations in combination, you might be able to explain all the evil that exists in the world. So, what I'll be giving you are pieces of the puzzle. And if we put the pieces together, maybe we could end up with a complete picture of why we have the world that we do. So, the first piece of the puzzle, matter. What I mean by matter is what things are made of. So, the first thing we notice is that things are made of stuff or materials. Everything in the world seems to be made of something. So, when God creates things, what we notice is that God seems to make things out of other things. Just the same way that chairs are made out of wood, and pots are made out of clay, and clothes are made out of cotton, plants are made out of stuff. So, one thing that has been said since Plato is that you can think of God like a potter molding clay. So God is making things. He's taking clay and he's molding things out of clay. One thing we know is that, well, it seemed to some people that if you have bad clay, then whatever you make out of that clay is not going to look exactly right. So if I have bad materials to work with, then the product that I create is not going to be perfect. If I make a table out of bad wood, then when I try and put the wood together, the wood is not going to hold together exactly right. So some people would offer this as the explanation for why you find birds without wings. That is, the material that God has to work with is not, right? Sometimes it doesn't always take the shape that God wants it to. This is not a very popular explanation with religious people for reasons you're about to see. But we're going to you'll be surprised to see that later we'll come back to this in the talk, and you'll see that there is something that religious people can find to agree with in this. But I want to start with the most controversial explanations for evil first. They also happen to be the Greek explanations, and the ones that we today tend to disagree with the most. So this is the Greek explanation. That is, that God has to work with, when God is making things, God has material to work with. But he doesn't have very good material to work with. And this is the question that Plato asks. What is the material that God has to work with when he's creating the universe? The answer? Chaos. He has chaos to work with. God has a bunch of stuff that keeps moving around randomly and chaotically, and God has to take that stuff, which is chaos, and he has to impose order on it. So God has to take chaos and turn it into order, which Plato will say is not easy. So, of course, according to Plato, God can only do this half successfully. That is, there are always going to be certain things about the universe that are random and chaotic. So God will be able to make the planets turn in a circular, whatever. He's going to make them turn in a regular way, right? Natural phenomena will move in very regular, ordered ways, but there will always be this chaos there that God just can't control. God can never completely eliminate chaos and randomness from the universe. So random and chaotic things will always still occur. So according to this theory, let's go here. So according to this theory, there's always going to be chaos there. And then if you ask, why is there chaos there? There's chaos there because that's not in God's control. How do you know? Because if it were in God's control, then he would impose order on it. He would make it ordered. So wherever you see chaos, that's a sign that God was not able to get that under control. However, wherever you see order, you're looking at God's work. Wherever there's order, that is what God has been able to control. So what we see is that God's power reaches to here. Wherever there's order, right, that's where God's power reaches as far as those things that are ordered. And where chaos starts, that's where God's power reaches its limit. So basically the theory is this, that is, the good things in the world are the things that have order, and the bad things in the world are the things that are chaos. So wherever you see good, you're seeing order. You're seeing the order that God has imposed on the world. And wherever you see bad things, you're seeing chaos. Things that God wasn't able to get under control. So of course, this is, is this explanation very popular with religious people? No. No, we don't like this. It's a very simple and beautiful explanation. Plato says, a god is only the cause of good things. It's a very simple thing to say. Bad things, he says, will find another cause for those things. But the only cause of good things, the only possible cause of good things is God. The only possible cause of bad things, well, whatever it is, it can't be God. But beautiful as this solution is, if we're religious, we can't accept this because we believe that God has power over everything. You will be surprised, however, that religious philosophers, even though they disagree with this in many ways, in some ways, there are other ways in which they agree with something like this. So we'll come back to this later. Let's go to the second explanation now. So this is the theory that evil is the absence of good. All right. So here you can understand what this means if we take as our example 3 bad things that are happening here. Here's something bad that's happening. A building is burning down. This is a plant that is dying. This is a person who has just lost their eyesight, a blind person. So something bad is happening in all 3 cases. So now if I ask you to point with your finger to the badness, I mean, where in the picture would you say is the badness or the evil? What's bad or evil here? The fire? Yeah, we would usually blame the fire. But if you say fire, this is one of God's creations. The fire does bad things. Here it's doing something we would consider bad, but fire also does good things. It warms us. It helps us cook food. It's natural to blame the fire, but what is so bad about this situation? What's so bad is that, if you think about it, what's so bad about this situation, the house burning down? What? Yeah, so it might have to do with human beings. But what if we say, it could always go back to human beings. But for right now, I just kind of want to ignore human beings, and then we'll come back to them. So if we imagine this fire was started by lightning or something. Now you want to blame the lightning. Well, think about it. When the fire burns the house, what we're going to see is that the walls of the house are going to start to break down. And eventually the walls of the house will be destroyed. We'll see holes in the house. What this means is that parts of the house are going to start to disappear. And that's important. Where there was a wall here, pretty soon there will be no wall. And this, some philosophers would say, is really the problem. That is, that parts of the house are disappearing. What we're actually watching is the house disappearing before our eyes, piece by piece. If we look at the flower, so what we're going to see pretty soon is holes in this house. Where there was something, now there will be nothing. If we look at the flower, what's wrong with the flower? The flower is dying. What's wrong with this picture? probably what's happening is that the flower is losing nutrients or water. So if we were to look inside this plant, what we would find is that before, when the plant was healthy, there was water there was nutrients, and now the water is gone. Or the nutrients that the plant needs is gone. Or something that the plant needs in order to keep growing is gone. Something's missing. And also, so what we see is that, right, things that the plant needs are disappearing. What we also notice is that as the plant dies, the plant is going to lose more and more petals. It will lose leaves. It will shrink to half its size. Before, the flower probably had, right, more leaves. Right? It had more blossoms. And now those are disappearing. Pretty soon, there will be nothing left. So before, right, before the flower had more leaves, stems, right, nutrients, right, the plant had more before, and now parts of the plant are disappearing. What was there before is no longer there. If we look at a person who's gone blind, this is Ibn Sina's favorite example. He always uses the example of somebody who gets kicked in the head by a horse and they go blind. What's so bad about this? Actually, if you think about it, it's the same thing. Something was there before that's not there now. Before, this person had the ability to see, and now this person's ability to see is gone. So there was something there before, the ability to see, and now it's missing. It's gone. So what this means is that evil or badness, when we see evil or badness in something, what we're looking at is something missing that should be there. We're looking at something that is not present that should be present. We're looking at something that ought to be there but isn't there. So in every case here, there's something we think that should be there that's not there. So, in a certain sense, well, now the question you guys are asking yourself is, how does this apply to human beings? I mean, when we say human beings are evil or bad, this theory can't apply to the human beings that we call evil or bad. But that's where philosophers would say, you're wrong. It's exactly the same thing. So, for example, if you think of a murderer, or think of the worst person that you could think of. Think of a really evil person, okay? Think of the worst person. I know you guys all have that special person in mind. Just visualize them, okay? Now I'm going to ask you, oh, this is really hard for me, to find the good in that person. Does that person, no, Mefish? Oh, you're here. Okay, so think of a murderer. Any goodness in a murderer? Any good at all? Does a murderer have any good qualities? Yeah. What good qualities do they have? Take a serial killer, for example, or Hitler. Does he have any good qualities? He's a good leader. He's charismatic. Is he intelligent? He's intelligent. He's organized. Right. He's brave. You could say that, right? Courageous. So, sorry, this was supposed to be two different. I'm ruining the surprise, actually. Don't look at that side of the screen. So if we just look over here. Okay. Here are Hitler's good qualities. Here are a murderer's good qualities, possibly. This is important because it means that every bad person has some good qualities. Now, the fact that he has these qualities, is that a problem? Is it a problem if you're intelligent? Is that a bad thing? No. Is it a bad thing to be brave? No. No problem. There's no problem with the qualities that he does have. So what's the problem with him? Yeah. The problem with him is the qualities or the personality traits that he doesn't have. So, if we think about it, right, he has no empathy. He has no humanity. He has no compassion. He has no love. He has no patience. These are good personality traits that he is missing. So the problem with him is not the personality traits that he has. The problem with him is the personality traits that he's missing. And now I know, you know, like when we say somebody is mean, right? I mean, this is why it's confusing, because if I say somebody is mean, right, it seems like I'm saying they have a personality trait. But if you think about it, when I say somebody's mean, what am I saying about them? Yeah, I'm saying they're not nice. I am saying they have no kindness. If I say somebody is lazy, what am I saying about them? I'm saying they have no ambition, no work ethic. If I say somebody is stupid, what am I saying about them? I'm saying they have no intelligence. So if you think about it, when you talk about what people are like, when you talk about the personality traits that a person has, what you'll notice is that most of the time when you describe somebody, you're telling me more about the personality traits they don't have than the personality traits they do have. And so, right, you could say the important, right, the thing that makes the difference between good people and bad people is, right, what are they missing? If a person is missing a lot of the personality traits that a person should have, they're bad. So this is important, right? So everything in the world, right, these philosophers would say has good and bad. Right? Usually what they have is good, and what they're missing is the problem. If we go back to our slide here. Okay, so here, the problem is what's missing, right? The problem is what's gone. The problem is what's not there. If I look at this house, this building, right? The building is being destroyed, but the parts of the house that are still there are good. There's still a window here. That's good. There's still a wall here. That's good. Same with the flower. There are parts of this flower that are still there and functioning, and they're good. They're not the problem. The problem is what this flower is missing. Same here. There are parts of this person's eye that are there, and they're fine. They're functional. The problem with this person's eye is what they're missing, right? They're missing probably the one thing they need, the one part of their eye they need in order to see, and they're missing the ability to see. So what's there is not the problem. What's there, if you think about it, is good. It's what's missing or what's not there that is the problem. So this is the theory. The theory is, right, whatever's there is good. What's missing and what should be there, that is the problem. That's bad. So according to this theory, have you guys seen that kind of cheese with all the holes in it? Swiss cheese. We could call this the Swiss cheese theory of the universe. The theory is that everything in the universe is like a piece of cheese with holes in it. All right, so here where there's something. Here, there's nothing. Right? So everything in the world is like this. There's something there, and there's something missing. What's there is good. What's missing, that's bad. So, does that make sense to everyone? Okay. So you're asking, well, like, how does this make me feel better about evil in the world? Well, two things. Number one, you ask yourself, how could God create evil? But if you think about evil this way, is evil the kind of thing that God could create? Still, yeah. Yeah. But he didn't. Yeah. We should come back to this during the question. Yeah. But the only point I want to make now is that, I mean, if according to this theory, evil is what doesn't exist, right? I mean, like literally, when you're looking at evil, you're looking at something that's missing, something that's not there, something that doesn't exist. Right? Then God doesn't set out to create what doesn't exist. What doesn't exist isn't something that somebody can create. It's not the kind of, right, the non-existent is not the kind of thing that can be created. We'll have to come back to them in the question period. But the idea is here that evil is the kind of thing that happens when two good things interact with two, when one, well, I should say, evil is the kind of thing that happens when things interact with each other and damage or destroy each other but evil is not the kind of thing that God actively creates. It's the kind of thing that happens when his creations interact or affect each other in certain ways such that they start to destroy each other. And we'll come back to this. This is only, that might not make you feel any better. But the second thing, some philosophers will point out that if you look at anything, it's mostly good and only partly bad. And sometimes it seems, at least it seems that way until the evil inside something grows and grows and grows. For example, this house starts to be destroyed and destroyed and destroyed, and bigger holes start to form until eventually the house is destroyed. And now you might say, well, now there's more evil than good there. But some philosophers would say, well, now you no longer have a house. If you no longer have a house, can you say there's anything wrong with this house? If there's no house there, there can't be anything wrong with it. So they will say, when you look at things in the world, they're mostly good and only partly evil. And if the evil increases past a certain point, then the thing is destroyed. But when the thing is destroyed, then there's no good there's neither any good nor any evil there left. The house is destroyed. Now there's no evil in the house because there's no house. That's the idea. Okay? We'll come back. So this is the theory, right? Good is what exists or what still exists, and bad is what no longer exists, what doesn't exist, or what no longer exists. Okay, the third thing. Some philosophers will say evil happens because God creates the world according to certain laws. There are natural laws in the universe. Once God makes a law of nature, he doesn't want to change it. Of course, this doesn't mean that God can't change it, but we think that God wants to create certain laws that govern the way that things happen in the world, and once God establishes those laws, once he creates those laws, we assume he's happy with them and he doesn't want to change them all the time. He could, but he doesn't want to. Of course, what this means is that if things happen according to these laws, then sometimes bad things are going to happen. Now, you can think about this in a modern scientific way, but you don't have to think about it in a modern scientific way. And actually, most philosophers didn't think about it that way. Most philosophers thought about it this way. They thought, well, it's a kind of law of nature that certain things in nature have certain powers. What I mean by powers is abilities, right? If something has a power, that just means it has the ability to do certain things. So, if you think about a plant or a flower has the ability or the power to grow. It has the power to bloom. It has the power to perform photosynthesis. It has the power or the ability to reproduce. Of course, there are certain things that a plant cannot do, so there are certain powers it doesn't have. A flower does not have the power to run. A flower does not have the power to fly. A flower does not have the power to fight. Those are just not powers that God gave the plant. When God creates a plant, he creates something with a certain set of powers and abilities, with certain powers and abilities, and without other powers and abilities. If you look at an insect has certain powers or abilities. It has the ability to fly. It has the power or the ability to eat plants. It has the power or the ability to reproduce. But there are certain things that an insect can't do. So it can't think, it can't talk. Those are powers or abilities that only human beings have. So what does this mean? This means that in the world, right, it could sometimes happen, right? So it's a law of nature that plants have these abilities and they don't have these abilities. It's a law of nature that plants have these abilities, that insects have these abilities and they don't have these abilities. So what this means is an insect can eat a plant . So what this means is that in our world, an insect can walk up to a plant and eat it, and then destroy the plant, and then the plant dies, right? And now God is not going to change the rules just because this happens once. In fact, he probably foresaw that lots of insects would eat lots of plants, right? So he's not going to change the rules now. He's not suddenly going to give the plant the ability to run away so that it doesn't die. But this kind of brings us to an interesting point about the examples that I was giving earlier. That is, now that we're talking about powers, it's important to mention that a lot of philosophers think that when we see bad things happening, what we're watching is things losing their power or things losing their abilities. So for example, when this insect eats this plant, the plant is going to lose its power to grow. It's going to lose its power to do the things that plants do. It's going to become weak and powerless. And that applies in all the other examples. Sorry. The same examples here. This person is losing their ability to see, so what they're losing is some power or some ability they have. The plant is losing its power to grow and to stay alive, right? It's losing its ability to do all the things that plants do. It might sound crazy does it sound crazy to say that a building has powers? Does a building have a power? Yeah, This building has the power or the ability to stand, to support itself. But with time, it's losing its power. So when we're looking at bad things happening, we're looking at things losing their powers. And now we know why that is. That is because things can use their powers or abilities against one another. The insect can use its power to eat the plant, and the plant will die. The plant dies because the plant only has the power to grow. It doesn't have the power to fight the bug or the insect. It doesn't have the power to fly or to run away. So, but this raises another question. That is, so now I've been talking about all this because it should raise a question in your mind now. And now your question should be, why does God create a world in which things can destroy other things and be destroyed? Why does God create a world where things have the power to destroy other things? We'll come back to that question in just a minute. Same here. The fire has the power to burn. It has this power, or this ability to burn things, and it will use that power against the building. And the building will lose its power to stand up. This brings us to number 4. This kind of brings us to the most common explanation for why bad things happen. Usually, what? Oh, the egg. Oh, yes. Ah, yeah, yeah, exactly. So, most of the time when I ask my students why bad things happen, they always say, bad things happen for a reason. What they mean by that is, bad things happen, and God intentionally causes bad things to happen because good things will come out of them later. So the idea is that God is causing bad things to happen right now, but later there will be a good result. This is very easy for us to understand because we ourselves often cause bad things to happen, knowing that there will be a good result later. Like, for example, when I make an omelet, I am crushing an egg. This is an act of destruction. I am taking an egg, I am destroying it. But I think this is okay because I'm making an omelet, a good thing. So this is something bad that will lead to something good. A more obvious example, I kill a tree. This is something bad, right? I'm causing death and destruction to the tree. But I'm going to create a table, which is a good thing. There's an objection from a vegan. Okay, so, yeah. Well, at least some people would justify their actions this way. So some people would say, I am justified in killing this tree. I am justified in destroying something because I'm going to create something. Destruction is bad, but creation is good. And we think in the same way that God must be doing something similar. In other words, we think God sometimes destroys things so he can create other things. So he causes destruction, which is bad, but out of that comes creation, which is good. So what this means is when we see a dying flower, we look at the flower and we ask ourselves, okay, this is something bad, some death and destruction, but then we always kind of ask ourselves, what's the good that's going to come out of this? Probably something good is going to come out of this, like, a new plant, or the soil will be fertilized, right? So we always, when we see these kind of things, we ask ourselves, okay, what's the good that's going to come out of this? And that's one way you can explain why bad things happen. But a lot of philosophers think that's just one way you can do it. You could also do it the opposite way around. That is, when you see something bad happening, you could, instead of saying, well, this is something bad, but the effect is good, you could see something bad and you could ask yourself, well, what is the cause of this? And what you will find is that the cause is good. So, what do I mean? Here, the plant is dying. This is bad. But if I ask myself, what's the cause of this? I might find here that this is something bad that's happening as a result, or a side effect, or a consequence of something good. So, a lot of philosophers would look at this and they would say, well, the plant is dying because of the insect. But the insect, if you think about it, is good. You say, what's so good about an insect? Well, according to some philosophers, the insect is one of God's creations. It's good. It exists. Just the fact that it exists is good. It exists and it's using its power to eat the plant. That is good from God's perspective. So this is something good that's causing something bad. Another thing you could say is that this insect, right? Another thing you could say is that the insect is good because the insect does something good in the world. And if we took the insect out of the world, or if we took insects in general out of the world, then we would be taking some good out of the world. Right? That is, if we take the insect out, we're taking out of a lot of other good things too. In the web of life, the insect is connected to other things. So I can't take the insect out of the world without taking other good things out of the world too. So they will say the insect is good, the plant dying, that is bad. But if you think about it, this is something good that has as a side effect or a consequence or an effect something bad. And another thing we could mention here too, before we move on to the last thing, is that, right, the insect is made out of something. The insect is made out of matter or material. Oh, sorry, that's not the last thing. But this insect is made out of something. If I dissect the insect and I take out what's inside of it, I could put all the stuff that the insect is made of on a table here. And it would just be a bunch of cells and tissues and dead matter. It would just be matter. It would just be material stuff. That's all it would be. When God makes things out of matter, he makes things that could just be stuff, but he gives them life. So when you see an insect, you're looking at more than just the stuff that an insect is made of. You're looking at the stuff that the insect is made of come to life. The insect is created out of matter. The interesting thing about anything that is made of matter is that it could be created out of matter, and it could also be destroyed back into matter. What I mean is, if you can make something out of that matter, then that thing that you made can be taken apart and disassembled and broken down and taken apart and broken down into matter. So if you create something out of stuff, like this. If you create something out of matter, then that means that thing can also be destroyed back into matter. The same with the plant here. The plant is made out of stuff. The stuff that it's made of can take on life and become a plant, or it could be destroyed back into matter. Why do I mention this? Because if the plant's alive, from the perspective of certain philosophers, this is good. The fact that this matter is taking on life, this is good. But this also applies to the insect too. So if this insect is alive, if it's not just a bunch of dead stuff, that is good. So I mention that just as another reason why some philosophers would say, some philosophers would say, when you're looking at the insect eating the plant, right? This is good. It is good that this insect is alive for the short period of time that it's alive. That is good, right? It could just be a bunch of stuff dead, but it is alive and well and healthy, and that is good. So when the insect eats the plant, that's bad, of course, but that's something bad happening because of something good that's happening right before our eyes, and that is the insect coming to life. Okay, this brings us to the next point. That is, some philosophers say, well, there's a difference between what God directly causes and what God indirectly causes. So, when you're building on the last point that I just made, when you're watching something come to life, when you're watching something alive and well, and when you're looking at it living and breathing and using its powers, right? You're looking at something that God is doing directly. That is, when I walk out here and I see a plant growing, you're looking at the hand of God, right? That is when you see, God is directly helping that plant to come to life and to grow. God is actively doing that. Some philosophers would say, right now, this is what God is actively doing. But some philosophers would say, of course, this plant, at the same time that God is helping it to grow, at the very same time, this plant could be negatively affected by the sun, which could dry it out. It could be negatively affected by the insect. It could be negatively affected by the sheep who could eat it. So these are all things in the environment that could negatively affect the plant. The point they make is that these things, God is not directly, actively causing that plant to be eaten by that sheep right now. God is not actively making that insect eat that plant. So, if we look at what's happening here, the things that are affecting the plant in a negative way, that's bad. But some people would say that's not bad that God is directly causing, in the sense that God is not actively making that happen at this moment. He sees that it's happening and he's letting it happen, for sure. But what he's actively doing right now is trying to help the plant to grow. So what this means is that they're going to say something very similar to the philosophers we talked about before, but different. What they're going to say is, when you're looking at bad, you're looking at something that God causes only indirectly. When you look at something good, right, a plant coming to life, creation, things living, breathing, that's God acting directly in the world. So this brings us to, your next question is, well, okay, but God knows that these sheep and this insect are going to eat plants like this. So what's with that? When God thinks about creating the world, he thinks about the kinds of things that he could put in the world. And he sees that if he puts certain kinds of things in the world, they're going to negatively affect each other. And then you ask, well, then why does he go ahead and create the world? The answer to that is, God sees that if he creates the world, there will be negative consequences. But he also sees the good. The good is that plants will grow, insects will thrive, right? Things will have life, and this is good. God goes ahead and creates this world because he's willing to take the good with the bad. He sees the bad that will happen as a consequence of putting these things in the world, but he's willing to take the bad with the good. And now we come to the last and I think really the deeper question, which is, so we should be asking ourselves deeper and deeper questions now. Now the deepest question you should ask yourself is the same question that we were asking before. Okay, but why? Okay, some people would say, but couldn't God put things in the world that are good and that stay good and that aren't destroyed? Couldn't he do that? In other words, couldn't we have a world where we have the good without the bad? I'll say that one more time. Can we have a world with good things that stay good and are never destroyed, can we have the good without the bad? So the question is, could God create that kind of world? Depending, yeah. Yeah. Here's where philosophers really start to disagree a bit. Yeah. Why not? Yeah, why not? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this is the difference between philosophers, right? So some will say, nope, it's not possible. Some will say, yes, it's possible. The ones who say, let's just talk about the ones who say, no, it's not possible. There are philosophers who say, look, it's not possible. Any world that God creates is going to have destruction in it. Why? Because when God creates, God is creating things that are less powerful than himself. If God makes something less powerful than himself, what does that mean? That means what? Yeah, he's creating something that could well, to last forever, you have to be really powerful, right? So there's a direct relationship between power and how long you last. Only the most powerful things can last forever. Look at God. The most powerful thing, he lasts forever. So if God makes something less powerful than himself, will that thing last forever? No. There's always the chance, some people say, that if he creates something less powerful than himself, that's something that can be destroyed. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but it will be destroyed sometime. And then if you think about it, the more that God creates, right, the more likely he's going to be creating things that are less powerful than himself. The more likely it is that God creates things that are less powerful than himself, the more likely it is that those things are to be destroyed. Also, we should think about the fact that when God creates things, he gives them different powers, right? He gives human beings a certain set of special powers. He gives insects a certain set of special powers. He gives plants a special set of powers. The fact that different things have different powers means they can use those powers against each other. I think this is the premise of every online game. Like I get special powers and then you don't have the power that I have, so I can use my power. So that's what happens in the world, right? You know, human beings have special powers so we can destroy other things that don't have the same powers as us. If something has a power that we don't have, it could use its power to destroy us. So, if you think about it, the more things that God creates, right, these different things will have different powers. And then the more likely it is that those things will be using their powers to destroy each other. Also, the more things that God creates, the more probably they're going to be competing with each other. So the chances are that those things are going to start to destroy one another. That's one answer given by the people who say, no, any world that God creates is going to have destruction in it. But there's another answer you could give, and that's the last one that I want to focus on tonight. That is, you could say, well, yes, God could. God could create a world with things that stay good and that can never be destroyed. He could do it. And then the question is, well, why doesn't he? Obviously, he doesn't want to. So then the question is, why? If God could create a world with good and no bad, if he could create a world where things are good and stay good and they're never damaged and never destroyed, why wouldn't he want to create that world? So that brings us to God's choice of world. So let's do a little thought experiment. Obviously, we can't go into all the details here, but here's an experiment we could do. Let's say God has his choice of two worlds. He could create world A, and he could create world B. World A is a world of things that cannot be damaged or destroyed. World B has things that can be damaged or destroyed. Why do you guys think, I mean, can you see any reasons why God might want to choose world B over world A? Disturbing. Yeah, that's disturbing. So God wants...
Because the other option is lot enough, if that happens.
Right, yeah. So God would, so yeah, you would say God would not want to be surrounded by demigods who could come close to challenging his authority. Maybe there.
Another God cannot be created. It's not possible to create another God. This is why there is a God. If we can create many gods,
Yeah, I mean, but he could create something slightly less powerful than himself. Some people say those things actually exist, and they're what we call angels. Or jinn. But I think there's a difference of, I mean, I think there's a difference between Islam and Christianity here. In Christianity, we're really taught that angels are close to God. I mean, way better than human beings. Whereas in Islam, I think, yeah, it's unclear whether, yeah. 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 I think that's another way of saying that no matter what God creates, everything he creates will be less powerful than him. So it will not have the ability to create, or it will be missing some ability that God has. Any other?
I think this is troublesome because if God cannot create a God, then God has a limited power.
I think
God is not all powerful because he's limited not to create another God.
Well, I mean,
I have one concerning this. I think that if I can argue that world A is better than world B, and world B is better than world A because basically there might be a lot of beauty and a lot of some of good in the imperfect, the damaged and the destroyed. I could say that basically the idea of the ideals of the perfection is basically what I can call evil.
yeah.
Because I see basically this appears in modern art that really worships what's damaged and destroyed, not perfection and beauty.
Right. So what we notice here is that probably these two worlds would contain very different kinds of goodness. World A would contain a goodness that lasts, a very long-lasting goodness, a goodness that can never stop. In world B, though, we might find a more fragile kind of goodness. In world B, we have the goodness of a flower blooming, which doesn't last very long. It's a very fragile kind of goodness. And it's a goodness that could easily be destroyed. So one possibility is that God would choose world B because God would want to create, maybe God would not be happy just creating a kind of goodness that lasts. Maybe God also wants to create a more fragile kind of goodness, a less long-lasting kind of goodness. Yeah. 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 Right. Yeah. So many philosophers are going to actually argue that actually we have the best of both worlds. That is, God created world A and world B. He created an eternal paradise, world A, and he created this world, world B. So we got like a package deal. That's one thing you could say. Yeah, and that's a very popular, right, that goes back to Augustine, right? So he says, you should not complain that we have very fragile kinds of goodness in our world, because more permanent kinds of goodness also exist. So you have both, right? You have no reason to complain if you have the fragile kind of goodness and the lasting kind of goodness. Oh no, we can't start with hell now. We'll get to that in a minute. But let's just focus on I'm not done with we should come back to this. But anyone have any other reasons why they think he might choose world B over world A? Yeah, in the back. So I need to know. Okay. So in order to be aware of the existence of world A, I have to live in world B. Okay, I like that. In world A? Yeah, there's no life. So would you say there is goodness in world A? No. So goodness that lasts is not goodness. Really? Mm-hmm. Right. So this brings us to a question that we've been kind of coming back to over and over again, which is, can you have good without bad? Is there such a thing as good without the bad? We asked that question when we were talking about human beings, right? Can you have a good human being without having a bad human being at the same time? Right? And now we want to ask that about the world, right? Can we have goodness in the world without the badness? Some philosophers say, it seems like opinion is split on this. Some philosophers say, you're right, you can't have the good without the bad. Some say, no, you could have the good without the bad. It's just that if we lived in a world with all good and no bad, we wouldn't call it good. So we wouldn't have the concept of goodness, but it would still be good. Maybe in order to recognize the good, you need the bad. But you could have good without bad. You just wouldn't recognize that it was good. Right. Yeah. So world A would be inconceivable without world B. Okay, here's one way we can think about it. Oh no, I didn't want that to. Okay. I didn't actually put those animations in there. That's by an accident. Okay, so. Okay, so here's one thing to think about, right? Let's think about it, right? What would happen if God created world A? Let's say this is God's power measured on a graph. I know it's haram to measure God's power on a graph. This is very bad. We should, of course, you cannot put God's power on a graph, but if you could put God's power on a graph, it would be, I mean, he would be the most powerful, okay? So his power would be like, right, if we're measuring. So let's say God creates something slightly less powerful than himself, right? So, or he makes certain kinds of things that are just slightly less powerful than himself. Okay? So God is the most powerful, and then we could imagine he makes something a little less powerful. And let's imagine he continues. After making this kind of thing, then he makes something less powerful. And then he makes something slightly less powerful. Okay, pretty soon, if God wants to create world A, right, he wants to create a world with no destruction in it, is he going to be able to keep doing this forever? Pretty soon, he's going to have to stop. Why? Right. So pretty soon God's going to start, so if God starts creating the most powerful things and he works down, eventually he's going to start creating things that can be destroyed. And then if he's creating world A, he has to stop. This is, imagine, if he wanted to create a world where there was no destruction. So if God created a world like world A, he would have to stop probably about here. Because if he makes anything else less powerful, then those things can be destroyed. And then he's allowing destruction into the world. So if God wanted to create world A, it would look like this, okay? But now let's imagine he does the same thing, but he creates world B. What would that look like? Yeah, this is what I was afraid of. Okay, this is world B. If God creates world B, then he can make all kinds of different things with all different levels of power. So he can make things that are more powerful, and he can make things that are less powerful, and he can make things that have very little power. Right? So he can fill the world with all kinds of different species, all with different levels and degrees of power. And all these things, right, have all different powers. So, what is the better world then? World A or world B? What would he choose then? Why would he choose world B? There would be more variety, yeah? Which world do you think has more goodness overall? No. Some philosophers say B. B. Why? Because in world A, you have only a few things that are very powerful. But here, let's see. So think about it. In world A, you have a few things that are very powerful. In world B, you have a lot of things that have low levels of power. So what would be the world where there is the most power overall? World A or world B? There's not a greater number in world B?
This does not reflect the number of species. It just reflects the variety. The type, not the number.
What do you mean by the type?
I can have, like, let's say the angels. Right?
Yeah.
I can have billions of angels.
Right.
And it's just one kind of species in world B and world A. So it's not reflecting the number of species and subsequently the number of good. It's just reflecting the variety and the difference of power.
Well, each one of these bars represents a species. So.
How many of those species do we have?
You mean how many members of the species? Oh, okay. We don't know. But presumably, you could have a lot of members of, yeah. So here are all the different species that God could make, right? So if we add up all the power, in world A and we add up all the power in world B, will there be more power in world A or in world B? No way. There's going to be more power, right? This is what some people claim. There's going to be more power here, right? These things are not very powerful. Each individual species is not very powerful. But if you add up the power of plants, and if you add up the power of insects and the power of human beings, and you add up the power of all the different species have, there's more power overall in world B than in world A. So some philosophers would say, okay, if you think about it that way, then there is more goodness overall. If you think about it, right? Power and goodness, same thing. When the insect is alive and is breathing and has power to do the things that an insect can do, when a plant is alive and is doing what a plant does and has the power to do the things that a plant does, that's good. So power and goodness, same thing. World B, they'll say, has a lot more power than world A. The other thing is, if God creates world A, is he restricting himself? Yeah. If God creates world A, he's putting limits on how much he can create. He's restricting himself to creating only certain kinds of things. Right? So God is imposing limits on his own ability to create. And he's also putting limits on how much goodness he can create. So if we go back. Sorry, I didn't do this at home. Okay. So if you remember the bars, right? Yeah, okay. Here God creates species 1, then species 2. Let's say he makes one species of demigod, one species of angel, one species of jinn, and then he has to stop because then he's going to start making things that are easily destroyed. Here he's putting limits on what he can do. So he's limiting himself to only making a certain kind of goodness. He's not allowing himself to go on and to continue creating other kinds of goodness. So we assume that God doesn't want to be limited in what he can create, and God doesn't want to be limited in terms of the goodness that he can create. He wants to keep creating, even if that means creating less lasting kinds of goodness, and he wants to keep creating even if he wants to keep putting good in the world, even if that means putting a more fragile kind of good in the world. Okay. You mean there's no limit on how many species he can create if he makes... Let me just restate. Okay, so you're saying God can make an unlimited number of species that are completely indestructible. I think some people would say no. Do you want to take this one, Robert? Dr. Robert. So he could create an infinite number of angelic species.
Just because of a finite subset of numbers, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's infinitely smaller than the set numbers, no matter how big you make that set.
Yeah, but are you assuming that aren't the powers that God has to dispense kind of finite in a certain sense? There's a finite number of powers that he can distribute among angels and...
Sure, but there's a finite number of powers you can distribute among creatures, right? In general. The point being that, like, he can create an infinite number, he can create a number of demigods, each more powerful than the last, right? Each can make a stone heavier than the other.
Mm-hmm.
But never
Yeah, and I think that's why, I mean, most philosophers like Augustine are going to choose to say it's not that God chooses world B over world A, it's that he chooses some combination of the two. You can't have them in the same world? Or really? Yeah. Did you want to? Sorry, I didn't catch the end of it. Oh. Do you want to? Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Of God with the speeches. It's about. I think that God can create unlimited sort of speeches. It's not a problem, but the problem is the interaction between these speeches together, because the one that's gonna be created with slightly less power than God Himself, and going down to the end of these speeches. So the one near, most near to God would have some sort of interaction with the less power speeches. So at that point, some damage, some interaction might happen, and destruction could occur at that time. So world A couldn't have unlimited number of speeches for that reason.
But this way, world A cannot have except one species.
If we are talking about a slightly less power from each species, so at some point, if the gap is very huge, very big, so things can go and interact together to dominate others.
Mm-hmm.
But if the gap is very limited, so each one could live by himself without going through other speeches.
Yeah. So there will be other considerations here, like, I mean, who knows what's going on in God's mind? This is only an experiment to prove that there might be some possible reason why God would have some possible reason for choosing world B over world A. But you could give many reasons. So one possibility would be the coherence of world B. That is, the species in world B kind of fit together better, and also you're saying there would be a primary consideration would be the disparity in power between the species.
Yes.
Yeah.
Things variate. Why are we making the assumption that for things that are variating in power, they have to, destroy one another? Maybe I can create a world where things just cannot destroy one another, like they can coexist in peace.
Yeah.
Like there can be infinite number of species, but each of them cannot destroy the other. So why the presumption that if something is less powerful than I am, then there is a possibility that I can harm him? Maybe this thing is immutable, like it cannot be destroyed.
Mm-hmm. So why can't God make things that are self-sufficient?
Yes, exactly.
That's a very good question. So one of the things we notice is that God creates things that are dependent on one another.
Yes.
So the question is, why can't God make things that are completely self-sufficient and don't depend on anything else? So their survival does not depend on the things around them and how the things around them affect them. That's the question?
Yes.
Yeah, you want to take it?
So basically, you should start with the assumption that dependence is a bad thing. But it's not always this way. So the existence of dependence lead to a lot